Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. So I'm sure most of you remember BabyP was the young toddler who died after months of abuse. And his mother, Tracey Connelly, is due to be released after a parole board had a recent hearing. This case sent reverberations around the UK over a decade ago, and Tracey Connelly was vilified. So recently, the parole board made the decision to release Connolly because apparently professional witnesses gave evidence saying that she was at a low risk of reoffending. This was all in the news as I record this today because the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, has urged the board to reconsider their decision. So in this episode, I'm going to talk you through the background of the horrific case of BabyP. I'm going to talk about the background of Tracey Connelly herself, and I'm going to answer the following questions. What is the parole board? What is its main function? How does it come to their decisions? And crucially, can a parole board's decision be overturned? I've also got some experience, not of sitting in a parole board myself, but of giving expert evidence as a psychiatrist in a few parole board hearings. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my experience of that, including telling you about my own personal case. And as a kind of side note, we're going to talk briefly about how Tracey Connelly was probably treated in prison. Okay, let's get started. So let's go to the background of the tragic case. So a bit of a trigger warning, obviously this is going to be very upsetting. So Tracey Connelly was vilified after she was jailed at the Old Bailey in 2009. She admitted causing, or at least allowing, the death of a 17-month-old son, Peter, the toddler, BabyP, at their home in Tottenham in North London in 2007. He died on the 3rd of August of that year. So he was known publicly as BabyP at the time, and he suffered more than 50 injuries, which to me is just kind of mind-blowing of that level of cruelty and neglect. Think about it, 50 separate serious injuries. The culprits were Tracey Connelly, as well as her boyfriend, Stephen Barker, and their lodger, who was called Jason Owen, who was also Barker's brother. So Barker was jailed for life with a minimum term of 10 years, separately for raping a 2-year-old girl, and was given a 12-year term to run concurrently due to his role in the baby Peter's death. And Owen was given an indefinite sentence with a minimum term of 3 years, which was later increased to a fixed 6-year term. And I'll explain what all of these things mean, minimum term, tariff, etc., later on in this episode. So as I said, this young toddler received 50 injuries despite being on the at-risk register and receiving 60 visits from social services and social workers. So obviously he was on their radars, but the police and healthcare professionals had seen him that many times, 60 times over the final 8 months of his life. And a series of reviews afterwards identified a number of missed opportunities when officials could have potentially saved the toddler's life if they acted properly and if they acted on the warning signs. So I'm sure most of you will remember that social services were heavily criticised and a few key people lost their jobs. And at the time there was a counter argument, which was that the blame should actually just land on the violent perpetrators themselves. So a bit of background into Tracey Connelly, BabyP's mother. So she herself came into contact with social services during her own childhood because she was brought up in Islington, also in North London, by a mother who had drink and drug problems. And as a child, she was sent to boarding school. Now, I'm telling you this not in any way to excuse her appalling actions, but I think nevertheless it helps put her kind of chaotic and troubled and unstable background into context. Then at age 16, she moved in with Peter's father, who was 17 years older than her, and the couple later married, but when Peter was born, or shortly after when Peter was born, that relationship ended. But Connolly then had a new boyfriend, who is Steve Barker, who is the perpetrator of much of the violence, and unknown to social services, Barker secretly moved into a home in Tottenham. So the police painted a picture of Connolly in court, and they said at best she was just kind of disinterested in her child. The Old Bailey heard that she rarely got out of bed before lunchtime, and even on the day that Peter was found dead, at 11:30 in the morning, she wasn't awake. And her home was described as disgusting. So when police searched it, they found dog mess, they found human feces, they found like rat holes burrowed into the walls. And Connolly admitted causing her child's death, and prosecutors said that she sacrificed him for her boyfriend. And in fact, not only that, she actually gave evidence to try and save Barker from a murder conviction, trying to tell the jury that he had in fact been a good father to his son. She said, and I quote, "I have lost all I hold dear to me. Now every day of my life is full of guilt and trying to come to terms with my failure as a mother. I punish myself on a daily basis, and there's not a day that goes by where I don't cry at some point." So, dear viewers, a Psych for Sore Guys, does that mean anything to you? Does her remorse mean anything? Do you believe her? Can a leopard ever change its spots? I've got a good feeling I know what you're going to say, but please let me know in the comments section below. But the judge of the trial, Stephen Kramer, told her that she was, and I quote, "manipulative and self-centered." And he said that he didn't accept her claims that she didn't know what was happening to her son. So Tracey Connelly was jailed for a minimum of 5 years in 2009. And then the Parole Board is allowed to consider release after that minimum period of time, formerly known as a tariff, every 2 years. So they considered her release in 2015, 2017, 2019, and was supposed to review it last year, but COVID, etc., it was delayed to this year, 2021. So they were either considering her release at all these times or moving her to an open prison. What you might find surprising, dear viewers, is that Connolly was actually let out on licence before. So she's actually been released in the past in 2015, but was recalled to prison in 2015 for breaching her parole conditions. And apparently this is because she was developing intimate personal relationships online, and also because she had been trying to incite another resident at her accommodation to engage in, and I quote, "inappropriate sexualised behaviour." However, in terms of the more recent Parole Board hearing, the one that's saying that she should be released, a spokesperson for the Parole Board said, and I quote, "We confirm that a panel of the Parole Board has directed the release of Tracey Connelly following an oral hearing. Parole Board decisions are solely focused on what risk a prisoner could represent to the public, if released, and whether that risk is manageable in the community. Parole reviews are undertaken thoroughly and with extreme care. Protecting the public is our #1 priority." Again, I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with that, so please let me know in the comments section below. Okay, as promised, I'm going to quickly explain what the function of the Parole Board is. So the Parole Board is an independent body. So even though they work in prisons, they are owned by, paid by, line managed by, governed by a different body from the actual prisoners. And their main job is to carry out a risk assessment on prisoners to make a decision about whether they can be released safely into the community. So the Parole Board was first established in 1968 under the Criminal Justice Act of 1967, and it first became an independent, non-departmental public body in July 1996. And the Parole Board deals with different types of cases. It has life sentences, so I've talked about this in some of my videos on my channel. A misconception is that a life sentence means life behind bars. It doesn't. That's a full-term life sentence. A life sentence means a life of being supervised by probation. But when the minimum term, it's now called a minimum term, used to be called a tariff. So for Tracey Connelly, that was for 5 years. Once that's passed, then the Parole Board can consider whether the prisoner can be released. And another type of sentence where that's relevant is the IPP. So some of you might have heard of this. That's the imprisonment for public protection. And it's kind of similar to a life sentence, but I suppose the similarity is that it's indefinite, and the defendant has to prove, the prisoner has to prove that they're safe to be released. But the difference is, in an IPP, it's not necessarily for life. IPPs, by the way, were thought to be inhumane and controversial because it was thought that there were a lot of prisoners who were serving time way beyond what was justified, and it was just like a form of government control to keep them locked up legally. So there was lots of human rights lawyers involved, blah, 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 and the whole thing got scrapped. But everybody who was previously on an IPP, like Tracey Connelly, still had to go through that process. So the Parole Board make the decision, but the onus is very much on the prisoner and their defence team, their lawyers, etc., to prove that the risk has decreased. How do they prove that? Well, for example, if they had drug and alcohol problems and that was related to the offending, then they can go through drug and alcohol rehab, they could go through anger management courses, they can go through vocational activities and get qualifications to set themselves up to get employment after they've left. They can prove that there have been no boundary breaches, or they haven't got into trouble whilst they've been in prison, so they've not got into a fight, not smuggled drugs, not broken the rules, etc., etc. And if they've got a mental illness, and this is my area of expertise, they have to prove that they've been through treatment, so they've had the right medication, the right assessments, etc., etc. So that is very much what my job was when I've worked in prisons in the past, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that later on in this video. So as I said before, I've got some experience of parole board hearings. I've never been a formal member of the board, but I've given evidence as an independent psychiatric witness, and I will expand on that later. The reason I'm mentioning that is because I think that it gives me a perspective to give my opinion on this case. Before I get to that, I just want to say the parole board chooses either if the prisoner is safe enough to be released, or if they can go to a lower level of security like an open prison. There was a controversial case about a man called Paul Robson that you might have heard about in the news, who was sent to open prison and went on the run. I'll talk about him later. Okay, so here is my opinion. I want to be very, very clear. I'm giving an opinion not on the punishment of Tracey Connelly, which I think was way too lenient, but on her risk of reoffending after 5 years of being in prison. So apparently, in the papers say that since being recalled to prison, she's been taking part in, and I quote, very intensive treatment program from the Ministry of Justice and the NHS over 3 years, and, I'm still quoting, is now able to work openly and honestly with professionals. So now I'm going to say something quite controversial. Even though what I think she did was absolutely horrendous, and I do genuinely think she deserved a much longer tariff. So even though I think her punishment, her original punishment, should have been much harsher, arguably now she's not at a high risk of reoffending. So before I get cancelled, and just to all you trolls hunched over your keyboards, I'll save you a headache, let me explain what I'm talking about. I'm taking all the emotion out of the case. I'm just looking at it logically. So I'm just doing a risk assessment. And a risk assessment is a bread and butter of a forensic psychiatrist. So for example, if general adult psychiatrists have patients that they think are too violent, too risky, they call in somebody like me to do an independent assessment. So why am I trying to justify that she's at a low risk of reoffending? She's got no long history of violence. There's no reports of violent behaviour or boundary breaches while she's been in prison. The context of her violence was very specific, so compared to somebody who's antisocial and commits daily violence. And once she's released, she can be very closely observed by social services, especially if she was to have another kid. That kid would almost certainly be taken away by social services anyway. So and also she's got other limited risk factors like drug and alcohol issues are not an issue, gang peers, etc., etc. So specifically in terms of her risk of reoffending, it's actually quite low. However, having said all that, the counter argument is that she did breach her bail conditions previously, although what she did, sexually explicit behaviour, was not violence, which was her original offence. So I just want to be 100% clear. I'm not excusing her behaviour in any way. And as I said before, I really want to emphasise, I think her original punishment should have been much longer. I think what she did was horrific. She deserved far more punishment. But I'm just saying the parole board's decision isn't about to extend that punishment. They're there objectively to talk about her risk of offending, and I think it's reasonable to say that that's relatively low. Okay, let's take it back to the concrete streets. Let's go back to what I originally said. So in the news today, the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, urged the parole board to reconsider, which leads me to a very important question. Can the parole board's decision be overturned? And the answer is this: all their decisions are provisional for 21 days, and this is referred to as the reconsideration window. Great name. And during that time, an application can be made by the Secretary of State to have the decision reconsidered. So not changed, but reconsidered. And that can only be done on a couple of grounds. If the correct process was not followed in the review, so if the review of parole, if there was important evidence missed, for example, or not taken into account, that's one reason. So say, hypothetically speaking, if there was some prison officer intel that Tracey Connelly had openly talked about her intention of harming kids, or had been on lots of fights, or had snuck in weapons into prison, blah, blah, blah. If that intel had been ignored or forgotten about, that would be a technical protocol reason to redo or to reconsider the decision of the parole board, or if the decision was irrational or unreasonable. And I think some people might argue that it was irrational or unreasonable. I'm sure many of you probably feel that way. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is it can't just be if the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, just says he doesn't like the original decision, or because he thinks the original offence was so horrendous, or because of public pressure. It has to be for a technical point of law. I hope that all makes sense. Okay, I'm going to change topics a little bit, and I'm going to answer the question, how would Tracey Connelly be treated in prison? So I've worked in female prisons, I've worked in male prisons, I've worked in locked psychiatric units, and I'm sure most of you probably know that there's a hierarchy of offenders. So this hierarchy exists, is definitely more pronounced in male prisons and in male psychiatric wards. So people like sex offenders, people who commit domestic violence against women are very near the bottom, and at the very, very bottom are childhood sex offenders. From my experience, I think the hierarchy for women is, let's say, more simplistic. I think that it's carried out with more fever and more force and more street justice in the male institute than the female, but still within female population, the female estate, the worst thing, the lowest rung on the ladder are women who hurt children. So I think that Tracey Connelly would have been targeted, would have been bullied. Maybe she even needed protection to go to a vulnerable prisoner's wing. Okay, so I'm going to change topics again, keep it moving, because I ain't got no time for shucking and jiving. I'm going to give you just a little window, a little insight into my own experiences of giving evidence as an expert witness in parole board hearings. Just to very quickly mention, as I said before, my name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in prisons, occasionally for parole, in psychiatric units and in courts, and I give expert evidence in criminal trials. My channel, A Psych for Sore Minds, talks about loads of different aspects of mental illness. So if you like your true crime with a twist of psychiatry, you should go and check out my video. Okay, I'm going to tell you about a real life case that I assessed for the Parole Board a couple of years ago. I'm not going to use his real name. Let's call him Mr. Bogues. I always, whenever I talk about my ex-patients, I always change the names to protect their identity, and also, more importantly, the identity of the victims and their families. But the essence of my case is 100% real. So please excuse if I come across rude. That's just me. That's how a psychiatrist has got to be. But my cases are still genuine with a capital G. Ask the colleagues in my practice, I'm as real as can be. So this man, Mr. Bogues, he was serving what I talked about before, an IPP, an indefinite sentence for public protection in HMP Thameside for serious assault, which was grievous bodily harm with intent, and that was committed in 2018. So it's a very brief background of Mr. Bogues, just to put him into context. He had a history of conduct disorder, multiple previous offences related to violence, serious offence towards a teacher, stabbed a teacher at the age of 14, expelled. He was in and out of prison regularly from the age of 15. A number of violent assaults, mostly in the context of intoxication and fighting his peers, who I suspect were drug dealers, and almost all of his fights happened when he was using alcohol and amphetamines. Mr. Bogues reported that he would take amphetamines for days, and he had paranoid ideas, and he would also hear voices telling him, warning him that people were trying to hurt him and to protect himself. But notably, all of that is in the context of drug use. So that's important for me as a psychiatrist trying to assess him, to see what context that all appeared in. First of all, it's in drug use, and secondly, it's arguable that his thoughts were quasi-psychotic, but also based in reality, because he was a drug dealer, he had wronged a lot of people, so it's natural for him to feel paranoid to a degree. So leading up to the index offence that I just mentioned, Mr. Bogues had a 3-week amphetamine binge. He didn't sleep for 3 weeks, which is mind-blowing to me. And he had a serious assault on a man that used to be his friend, and that man came into a pub drunk, challenging Mr. Bogues to a fight because of rumours that he had ripped him off in a previous drug deal. So Mr. Bogues took out a machete from the back of his van, chased this man and sliced off his ear. And if it had been like a couple of inches to the right, he probably would have been facing a murder charge. So Mr. Bogues pleaded guilty, went to prison, and even when he was in prison for a short time afterwards, when he was first in custody, he was still really psychotic, and he was prescribed antipsychotic medication, which he took throughout his entire prison sentence. And he was still a bit paranoid, still kind of thinking that people were after him for the first few months, had a few fights whilst he was in prison. After that, he calmed down, stuck to the rules. He did lots of rehabilitation, thinking skills program, victim awareness course. If any of you people listening have been to prison, you've probably heard of these courses. I'd like to know your comments on whether you think they're helpful in the section below. So here's the psychiatry bit. Pay attention, nerds. So Mr. Bogues attracted a diagnosis of schizophrenia in prison, and that's why he was being treated with antipsychotic medication. But I, after my assessment, think that that was a red herring. I think it was a drug-induced psychosis, and I'll tell you why, very briefly. Because there was no evidence of any overt psychotic symptoms outside of the context of him using drugs. So, he was still reeling from the effects of drugs when he first went into prison, but then he wasn't paranoid or psychotic after a few months had passed. So that's significant in my view. He didn't have the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So people with schizophrenia have things like poor cognitive ability, a lack of volition, which is like motivation, a problem with the clarity of their thoughts. They have what we call psychomotor retardation, so they move very slow, they think very slow, they speak very slow. So my recommendation for the parole board was that we should try to really slowly withdraw his antipsychotic medications, because these are not nice drugs and they have harmful long-term side effects such as cardiac arrhythmias. They can decrease your life expectancy. However, I pointed out that you'd have to decrease the dose really, really slowly to prevent the possibility of re-emergence of symptoms if I was wrong and if he did have schizophrenia. What I think was quite interesting was that his solicitor was really pushing for me to recommend antidepressants and to tell the parole board that Mr. Bogues was depressed. But I think this was just to exaggerate his willingness to be involved in rehabilitation. I didn't think there was any clinical reason to prescribe antidepressants, because I didn't think he was clinically depressed. So as I told the parole board when I gave my evidence, in my opinion, the link between Mr. Bogues' mental state and his previous offending was always confounded by his drug use. And all of his previous offending assaults, even though his index offence, the thing that got him into prison, again, was in the context of drug use. Therefore, the mental health treatment isn't really that important in this particular case. So I said, although ultimately it's up to the parole board to decide, my recommendation was that they considered moving him to a less secure prison, so an open prison, levels of reduced security, at some point in the near future, so that he could start ROTL, so that's release on temporary license. It's like day release, to see if he's safe enough to definitely be released into society. And these are my reasons, right? He'd already served a relatively long prison sentence. I think it was 8 or 9 years at that point. He'd already gone through a plethora of therapies and at least superficially appeared to have assimilated the knowledge from therapy. I acknowledge that some people can fake that, but that's a whole other topic. And crucially, aside from the first few months, there have been no reported boundary breaches in prisons, no adjudications, etc., etc. I also said, look, you could at a stretch follow his mental health by a local community mental health team after he's been discharged, but to be frank, it's probably a touch of overkill, but a couple of appointments here and there just to make sure that he's stable once he's been released, probably not a bad idea. However, more importantly, in my opinion, that he should remain abstinent of illicit drugs, because that was his main trigger, and that is not a mental health issue. It's an issue that has to be overseen by drug and rehabilitation services, and the probation services have to follow him up by seeing him regularly, urine drug screens, etc., etc. So that's just a little insight of how psychiatric expert evidence works in a parole board hearing. Okay, don't worry guys, we're almost finished. In conclusion, everything I've been talking about in terms of Tracey Connelly is yet another situation where the parole board has been criticised. There's been quite a few of them recently. If you're into your true crime, you've probably heard of these. So recently there was a double child killer, Colin Pitchfork, who at the age of 61 was released last year by the parole board in September 2021 after spending 33 years in jail for murdering 2 teenage girls in the 1980s. Shortly afterwards, after his release by the parole board, he was arrested and recalled to prison because he'd apparently been approaching young women on multiple occasions whilst he was on walks from his bail hostel. Another one, which you've probably heard of, was Paul Robson. This was very recently. So he was recaptured after fleeing from an open prison, and he was sent to the open prison on the advice of the parole board. He was originally given a life sentence in 2000 after he sexually assaulted a woman at knife point. But then he went to this open prison, escaped. This is recently, this is February 2022. went to HMP North Sea Camp in Lincolnshire, which was an open prison, and he just literally walked out, spent 4 days on a run until Robson was arrested in Skegness. So let's face it, life is not looking good for the dude. Not only is he facing a much, much longer prison sentence, as the Parole Board are very unlikely to release him anytime soon, but he's only had 4 days of freedom in 33 years, and he spent most of that in Skegness. So to conclude, in this episode, we covered the horrific background story of BabyP. We looked a little bit into the background of Tracey Connelly. Again, not to excuse her actions, they're despicable, diabolical, but just to understand the context of what happened. I talked about the role of the Parole Board. I explained how they go about making their decision. I explained whether their decision can be overturned. And we talked briefly about how Tracey Connelly would be treated in prison. I gave you just a little snapshot into life as a forensic psychiatrist when it comes to Parole Board hearings. By the way, if you're interested in those cases that I just mentioned, so Paul Robson and also, sorry, I just lost my thought there. Paul Robson and Colin Pitchfork, I've done videos on both of those individuals and talked about the whole processes on my channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. As I said before, I've got my YouTube channel covers lots of different aspects of true crime with a sprinkling of psychiatry. I go through high profile cases like this, react to news stories like this. Some of them are more about broader kind of topics to do with mental health and offending. Go check out my channel. All that remains is for me to give a massive shout out to my boy, Sean Atwood, the king of YouTube true crime. Go and check out his amazing channel as you already are doing. Check out his other videos. And that's it from me. Peace, stay euthymic, and whatever happens, do not forget, I love you.